For more insights, let's talk to Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow and Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney in Shanghai. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Mr. Felgenhauer. Do you think such meetings can result in a concrete outcome, especially when the Russian narrative for decades has been that NATO promised not to carry out its eastward enlargement after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it looks like it's a basic question of lack of trust.
Well, there's lack of trust, and there's also a problem because Russia does not really like to have talks with NATO as an organization. I mean, the Russian delegation came, it met the NATO nations, 30 nations sitting at the table with a already prefixed position. And Russia came also with its own Russian diplomats and military, their own position. And the NATO countries sitting there at the table could not possibly change their position while the negotiations were there without going to another room and finding a new consensus. So Russia does not really believe that such talks with such big entities, groups of nations, are productive. So this was more of an exchange of fixed positions and statement of those fixed positions.
Professor Mahoney, tell us a little bit more about the Ukraine issue in Biden's diplomacy, especially when in his efforts trying to mend ties with European allies.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about Biden is that he has consistently tried to position himself in the U.S. domestic political scene as the opposite of Trump. And by this I mean that he was going to be tough on Russia, but at the same time, he sort of consistently looked past Russia in his obsession with China. So, I think Putin has kind of caught him out on this now, and he's being forced to pay not only Russia but European security more direct attention at a time when he really would prefer not to.
Mr. Felgenhauer, do you think eventually Ukraine, or at least eastern Ukraine, will become a tipping point?
Well, Russia says it doesn't have any intention to invade Ukraine, but at the same time, Russian officials say maybe Ukraine will provoke something, some kind of escalation of the conflict there. So an escalation is not really right now. No one says that it's impossible. It's possible, but basically it can be avoided. What was said there by the chief of the Russian delegation at the meeting with NATO, Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko, is that Russia right now is contemplating other military technical means. Apparently, maybe that would mean deploying of new intermediate nuclear missiles. Now that the INF treaty is defunct, Russia has a right to do that. Deploying them in forward positions to put the European and maybe even also America and its allies into a more threatening situation to exert pressure. So that's most likely what would be the immediate right now reaction, that these talks have been unsuccessful.
Mr. Felgenhauer, we know Russia has delivered 2 lists of demands to both the United States and NATO, and many observers are saying that many of the issues in those lists are actually bottom line issues for the West, US and NATO. So what's the real expectation in Russia for those demands?
Well, actually, Russia offered the United States to sign a kind of treaty, something binding, and maybe some kind of declaration with NATO. Russia does not believe that negotiating with NATO makes much sense. It believes in bilateral negotiations with different NATO members, and primarily, of course, with the United States. And that's why the meeting in Geneva, they had first a preliminary meeting, a dinner on the 9th, then 8 hours of negotiations on the 10th. So this was really much more intense, and the head of delegation was Ryabkov, who was really in charge of not only of America, but also of nuclear control issues. So that's where Russia is going to put the main emphasis, to try and find some kind of quid pro quo with the United States, believing that NATO countries will have to follow the American lead willy-nilly.
Professor Mahoney, we know Ukraine will actually have a seat at a table on this OSCE meeting on Thursday in Vienna. Do you think any breakthroughs can be made this time?
I don't think so. I think Pavel's right that the main actors here are the U.S. and Russia. The OSCE cannot speak for NATO. It cannot really speak for Washington. It can encourage a political and diplomatic solution, but I don't think we should expect much of substance from this meeting.
But we're familiar with this narrative from U.S. diplomats saying that no decision on Ukraine will be made without a Ukraine present. So this looks like totally contradictory to those words.
Well, you're right, and that's what we saw in the meeting in Geneva. We saw the U.S. Taking the lead. But, you know, if you go back just a few weeks and a couple of months, Europe and the rest of NATO did not really see Russia as a threat here. And it was really the U.S. prodding on this issue that sort of brought NATO and the rest of the NATO members in line. Now, whether or not it's a threat, whether or not Russia wants it to be perceived as a threat, they say that they're not going to invade. It's really kind of a gray area. But it's clear that this confrontation is largely between the U.S. and Russia, and certainly the U.S. is playing a pivotal role right now in Ukrainian security, providing both arms and funds.
Thank you very much, Professor Josef Gregory Mahoney in Shanghai and Mr. Pavel Felgenhauer in Moscow.